That is enough of your insolence. This behavior will not be tolerated.
There are courtrooms where nothing happens, where people shuffle in, pay a fine, shuffle out, and the whole thing is forgotten by noon. And then there are courtrooms like this one, where someone walks in so certain of who their father is that they forget completely to think about who they are. Where a name that was supposed to be a shield becomes, by the end of the morning, the very thing that buries a person. This is one of those cases, and by the end of it, even the officers sitting in the back row were on their feet clapping. I am Frederick. I cover courtroom stories that stay with me long after I close the case file. This one stayed longer than most. If this kind of story is why you found this channel, go ahead and hit the like button before we get into it. It was a Thursday morning in Providence, and the courtroom was more crowded than you would normally expect for that hour on a weekday. Off-duty officers had come in and quietly taken seats along the back rows. A few local reporters were already settled in with notebooks open, which told you something was expected, something beyond the usual small claims and traffic disputes. The regular gallery was filling in too. Ordinary people waiting on their own matters, completely unaware that they were about to witness something they would be describing to other people for years afterward. The defendant arrived 20 minutes late. Madison Garrett, 24 years old. She came through the heavy courtroom doors with a Starbucks cup in one hand and her phone in the other, sunglasses still on indoors, moving at the exact pace of someone who has never once been asked to hurry up. The bailiff called her name twice before she even acknowledged she was standing in a room with other people. She didn't apologise for being late. She didn't look at the court staff. She didn't acknowledge the gallery or the judge or the officers or anyone. She just exhaled long and deliberately, like the entire proceeding was something unreasonable being done to her personally on an otherwise perfectly fine Thursday morning. That exhale told you a great deal before a single charge was read. Judge Frank Caprio was already at the bench when she arrived. Those who knew his courtroom, the regulars, the staff who had worked with him for years, could read him in small ways that outsiders might miss. That Thursday morning, there was something quieter about him than usual. Something more deliberate. Two folders sat in front of him on the bench. One was the standard case file, the other had a red tab along the edge and was marked confidential. He glanced at it once, then at the young woman who was still half attending to her phone. When the bailiff finally read the charges, the temperature in the room shifted immediately and visibly. Driving under the influence with a blood alcohol content of 0.12, hit and run, leaving the scene of an accident with property damage estimated at $8,500. Those are serious charges under any circumstances. They carry real weight. They are the kind of charges that make most defendants go pale and quiet. Madison Garrett rolled her eyes. That moment, right there, before a single word had been spoken in her defense, told you almost everything about what the next hour would look like. From a purely analytical standpoint, the eye roll was probably involuntary, a reflex. The automatic response of someone who has learned over a long period of time that consequences have a way of dissolving before they ever fully land. She wasn't performing contempt for the room. She genuinely did not understand why this should concern her in any serious way. That distinction matters because it explains everything that followed. Judge Caprio put his glasses down with deliberate care and asked whether she understood the charges before her. Her response was that the whole thing was ridiculous and that she hadn't even been drunk. She told the court the other car barely had a scratch. She waved her hand while saying it, the way you'd wave away something slow-moving and insignificant. She said her insurance would handle the damage. When the judge asked her directly why she had left the scene of the accident, she said she had somewhere to be. And then she added with complete seriousness that it wasn't that big of a deal. Judge Caprio asked the question that should have given any defendant pause. He asked whether she had checked to see if anyone was injured before she drove away. Madison shrugged. She said the person was fine. They were standing. In the back of the courtroom, an elderly woman in a neck brace quietly closed her eyes. When the judge noted that these were serious charges, that driving under the influence and a hit and run were not minor traffic matters, Madison shifted into a different gear. She stopped reaching for casual dismissals and reached instead for something she had clearly used before: something that had worked before. She told him that she didn't know if he was aware, but her father was Chief Michael Garrett. She said the whole thing was probably just a misunderstanding. Her tone changed as she said it, taking on that practiced, measured confidence of someone who knows exactly which card they're holding and exactly when to play it. The courtroom went completely still. The court reporter's fingers stopped moving over the keyboard. Judge Caprio looked at her steadily and said in an even voice that he was very aware of who her father was. And Madison smiled, not nervously, not apologetically. She smiled the way someone smiles when they've just been told they can leave early, relief mixed with certainty. She pushed her sunglasses up into her hair and she stood there with the expression of a person who has never once watched a situation go the wrong way. What she said next is worth sitting with for a moment. She told him that then he would understand it could be handled quietly. She said she thought they both knew how these things worked. Her voice had that easy, knowing quality that comes from years of watching closed doors open at the right word from the right person. She wasn't being dramatic. She wasn't bluffing. She genuinely believed she was in the middle of a conversation that had a familiar ending. This is the moment in a story where I feel something that's hard to describe as any single thing. It's not quite anger. It's more like a slow, heavy disappointment that settles in the chest. Because she wasn't entirely inventing the world she was describing, 3 years of records would prove that the world she was describing had been real, had been operating, had been protecting her each time. She just didn't know she had walked into the one room on the one morning in front of the one judge where that world no longer applied. The prosecutor rose and presented evidence. The footage from that night showed a CVS parking lot, the harsh overhead lights making everything look flat and sickly. A white Mercedes sat at an angle, its front bumper crumpled and its headlights shattered. 2 officers approached the vehicle. The audio captured Madison's voice, slurred and aggressive, asking whether they knew who her father was. The officers remained professional and asked her to step out of the vehicle and submit to a breathalyzer test. She refused. 3 times. She threatened the officers. She mentioned her father 7 times in the span of 4 minutes, pressing a name into every gap in the conversation like it was the answer to every question being asked. When she finally submitted to the test, the result came back at 0.12, 50% above the legal limit, clear by any standard, dangerous by every measure. When the footage concluded, Judge Caprio asked if she had anything to say about what the court had just reviewed. She said the video was taken out of context. She said the officers had targeted her because of her last name. She said this without any visible awareness that she had been using that same last name as a shield actively and repeatedly for the past 15 minutes. The judge folded his hands on the bench and told her plainly that this was not a transaction. He said she had endangered lives, fled the scene of an accident and shown no remorse at the time of the incident and no remorse now. Madison called that dramatic. She said she had only been going 30 miles an hour. She suggested that the judge was blowing things out of proportion. Then Judge Caprio said something that quietly shifted the entire weight of the room. He repeated her own words back to her. He said, "You stated that the person you hit was fine, that they were standing. Is that correct?" Madison nodded and even leaned forward slightly, sensing something she interpreted as an opportunity. She said, "Yes, exactly. They were literally standing there yelling at her." She said that if they were really hurt, they wouldn't have been able to stand. She said it was just common sense. Judge Caprio looked toward the gallery and asked the bailiff to have Mrs. Chen approach. Madison glanced around, mildly curious, the way you are when a name means nothing to you. And then the elderly woman in the neck brace stood up. She rose carefully and slowly, one hand gripping a cane, the other pressed gently against her ribs, as if the simple act of standing required negotiation with her own body. She was 68 years old, small frame, silver hair, eyes that carried a particular expression of someone who has been through something and is only now being given the space to say so. She made her way from the gallery to the witness stand, one careful step at a time, and the courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of her cane against the tile floor. A slow, rhythmic sound that seemed to grow louder with each step. When she settled into the witness chair and looked up, she looked directly at Madison Garrett. the young woman who had struck her car, who had screamed at her in the intersection, who had looked at her holding her ribs in pain and driven away. Mrs. Chen's voice when she spoke was soft, but it carried to every corner of that room. She had been driving home from physical therapy, she explained. Hip replacement surgery 3 months earlier, going beautifully by every measure the doctors had given her. She had stopped at a red light on Waterman Street, just sitting there, waiting for it to change, when the impact came from behind. Her car lurched forward into the intersection. The seatbelt caught her, but the force of the collision was like being hit by a wall. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Everything hurt at once. She had gotten out of her car to check on the other driver, she told the court, because that is what you do when something like that happens. You check on people. You make sure everyone is safe. What she found was not someone checking on her. The other driver was angry. She was out of her car and already yelling at Mrs. Chen, telling her she had stopped too suddenly, that she shouldn't be driving if she couldn't handle traffic. Mrs. Chen tried to explain that she had been stopped at a red light, that the light had been red, that she needed to call the police because she was in pain and her car was damaged. She tried to explain all of this while struggling to stand upright, while pressing one hand against her ribs, while the pain was still shooting through her from the impact. And this young woman, Mrs. Chen said, looked right at her, saw her struggling and said, "I don't have time for this. Deal with your own problems." Then she got back in her car and drove away. The gallery was silent. Someone in the back made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and something deeper, a sound people make when something hits them in a place they weren't prepared for. I have thought about that moment many times since I first came across this case. An elderly woman, post-surgery, alone in the middle of an intersection with cars honking around her, calling 911 on her own phone, waiting 30 minutes for an ambulance to arrive. She did not ask to be part of this story. She was on her way home from physical therapy. She was stopped at a red light. She did everything right, and she still ended up sitting in a courtroom weeks later, wearing a neck brace, explaining to a judge what it feels like when someone looks at you in pain and decides you are not worth their time. That is not abstract. That is a real person's real experience, and it deserves to be said plainly. Mrs. Chen described her injuries without embellishment. 3 cracked ribs, severe whiplash. The impact had undone some of the progress from her hip surgery. She had spent 3 days in the hospital. She told Judge Caprio that she had lived 68 years and had known pain before. Real pain, the kind that comes with surgeries and age and the physical costs of a long life. But lying in that hospital bed in the days after the accident, not knowing whether she would ever walk without difficulty again, not knowing whether the recovery she had worked so hard for was lost, that had a different quality to it. It was not just physical pain. It was the pain, she said quietly, of knowing that someone saw she was hurt and chose to leave her there like she did not matter at all. Judge Caprio's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He turned to Madison and asked her directly, "You told this court that Mrs. Chen was fine, that she was standing, that this incident was being overstated. Did she still maintain that position?" Madison's voice had gone smaller. She said she hadn't known Mrs. Chen was that badly hurt. She said she was standing, so how was she supposed to know? Mrs. Chen's response came immediately, steady and clear. "Because you could have stayed. Because you could have asked. Because that is what human beings do when they hurt someone. They stay, they help, they take responsibility." For a moment, the room held that. And then Madison Garrett, facing a 68-year-old woman in a neck brace who had just described 3 cracked ribs and 3 days in the hospital, and the particular pain of being left alone in an intersection, snapped at her. She said maybe Mrs. Chen shouldn't be driving if she couldn't handle a little bump. The gallery erupted. Officers in the back row rose from their seats. The bailiff stepped forward instinctively. Judge Caprio stood, and his voice cut through the noise like something cold and final. He asked her, with absolute calm, whether she had just blamed a 68-year-old woman for her drunk driving. "I want to pause here and ask you something directly. Leave a comment below. When you watch someone respond to an injured elderly woman that way, in open court, in front of everyone, did it surprise you? Or did it feel like the predictable endpoint of someone who had spent years being told the rules apply to everyone except them?" The room fell into a charged and dangerous quiet. Madison did not stop. She said Mrs. Chen might be exaggerating to get money out of the situation. She said older people did that. Mrs. Chen sat in the witness chair with tears running down her face and said nothing more. Then Judge Caprio reached for the second folder, the one with the red tab. He explained with measured deliberateness that the court had been provided with documents from the State Attorney General's office concerning an active investigation into Chief Michael Garrett. Corruption, tampering with evidence, the systematic dismissal of traffic citations issued to family members and political allies over an extended period. Madison's own name appeared in that file 27 times across 3 years of documented incidents. Madison said it wasn't her fault, that she couldn't be blamed for what her father had done. Her voice had taken on a higher, strained quality. Judge Caprio told her, without hesitation, that he was not holding her accountable for her father's actions. He was holding her accountable for her own. The prosecutor then presented the text messages subpoenaed as part of the corruption investigation. They appeared projected on the screen for the court. One exchange showed Madison texting her father after being pulled over. Casual, almost playful, followed by his response that he would handle it, followed by her telling him he was the best and that it was great having a cop dad. Another exchange came after a parking lot incident at the club. She had texted that she had already left. He had responded with alarm. She had told him to just fix it like always, with a shrugging emoji attached. Casual as a grocery list. What those messages showed, taken together as a sequence across years, was not a series of isolated mistakes. It was a running arrangement. A father who loved his daughter enough to compromise everything he was supposed to stand for. A daughter who accepted that compromise without a moment's hesitation and returned to it again and again because it had never once failed her. That is a painful thing to look at directly, not because it's unusual in every particular, but because of the scale of ordinary damage it produced. 14 other people whose cases have been quietly dismissed. 14 other incidents absorbed into silence while Mrs. Chen waited alone in an intersection for an ambulance that took 30 minutes to arrive. Madison came apart. She called the messages private and illegally obtained. She called the proceeding a witch hunt. She said she was being targeted because of her father's name, without appearing to notice the irony that she had been trying to use that name as protection for the better part of an hour. She moved toward the bench. She pulled her phone out when ordered not to and began dialing. When the bailiff moved to take it, she shoved him hard, two-handed. He stumbled backward into the defendant's table. Officers moved from the gallery immediately. The bailiff recovered. Judge Caprio's voice came down over all of it, sharp and clear. He told her she had just committed assault on a court officer in front of every person in that room and in front of every recording in operation. He told her there was no self-defense claim available. She screamed at him. She called the court a joke. She told him her father had more power in this city than he would ever have. Then she turned toward Mrs. Chen in the witness stand, still weeping quietly, and told her she was probably faking it for the lawsuit. She said she should have never stopped at all, that she should have just kept driving. The room was completely frozen. Judge Caprio sat back down slowly. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, in a way that carried further than any raised voice could have. He said that in 35 years on the bench, he had seen anger, fear, desperation, and genuine remorse. He had given second chances to people who needed them and who earned them. He had shown mercy where mercy was warranted. What he had witnessed that morning, he said, was not a mistake made by someone who didn't know better. It was a pattern. Entitlement so deeply embedded that it had stripped away the capacity to see another person's pain as real, as something that mattered, as something worth one moment of consideration. The sentence came down piece by piece. 90 days for the DUI, 60 additional days for the hit and run causing bodily injury, consecutive. 30 more for contempt of court, 60 more for assaulting a court officer, consecutive. 240 days in total, 8 months. Full restitution to Mrs. Chen estimated at $45,000. Fines totaling $8,500 across the separate charges. A 5-year license suspension, the maximum permitted under state law. 500 hours of community service after release, specifically assigned to work with victims of drunk driving, so that the people on the other end of choices like hers would become real to her in a way they clearly had not been. Mandatory alcohol counselling twice per week for 2 years. And then the final element, the one that set this case apart from most. Judge Caprio announced the creation of a statewide public registry for individuals convicted of using familial or political connections to evade legal consequences. A permanent, accessible public record. Any future legal infraction of any kind would result in automatic maximum penalties with no possibility of reduction, no plea bargaining, no dismissal. The consequences of this morning would follow Madison Garrett, not for the length of her sentence, but for the rest of her life. The gallery stood. The officers in the back row clapped. The court reporter, who had maintained professional stillness through everything she had witnessed that morning, had tears running quietly down her face. Madison begged. She said she was sorry. She said she would apologize to Mrs. Chen immediately. Right there, right now. She would pay everything. She would do anything. Judge Caprio's answer was that she had been given many chances across that entire proceeding to show remorse. Each time, she had chosen something else. The sentence stood. As she was led out in handcuffs, Mrs. Chen rose slowly from the witness stand. When Madison passed close to her, the elderly woman spoke just clearly enough to be heard. She said she forgave her. She said she hoped that Madison would eventually learn what she herself had learned through a much harder road. That all of us are fragile. That all of us need each other. That basic human kindness is not a limited resource, and spending it costs nothing. Madison's sobbing grew louder as the doors closed behind her. 6 months later, the follow-up was straightforward. Madison served every single day of her sentence without reduction. Chief Michael Garrett resigned and pleaded guilty to corruption charges, receiving probation and a permanent lifetime ban from law enforcement. Mrs. Chen received her full restitution and has largely recovered, though she still carries pain that wasn't there before September 14th. 14 previously dismissed cases were reopened and properly adjudicated. The accountability registry was adopted statewide. If you believe that accountability matters, that courtrooms like this one are worth paying attention to, subscribe to Frederick Explains Court. That is exactly what this channel exists to document. One case, one hearing, one human moment at a time. Justice does not always arrive on time. Sometimes it is 20 minutes late, just like the person it came for. But when it finally walks through those heavy wooden doors, it does not check who your father is. It just sits down, opens both folders and gets to work.